Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about the respiratory system. The way I want to structure this video is first I want to talk about physiology and order the events that take place, and then I want to talk about anatomy. And then for the physiology, there's really three big main events I want to talk about. And that is, first, I want to talk about how respiration is initiated. That is the neural component of it. Second, I want to talk about how air moves in and out of the lungs. That is the muscular contraction component. And third, I want to talk about the physical chemistry relating to how the gases diffuse, the oxygen diffuses in and out, and the carbon dioxide does the same. So first, before we talk about those things though, I also want to say one more thing, which is I want to talk about something important to understanding the nature of the respiratory system, which is why do we need lungs in the first place? That is, what is the purpose of it all? Well, as it turns out, we are living organisms that consume energy from other organisms via a series of chemical reactions that ultimately consumes glucose in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. And in the process of these gradual oxidation and reduction reactions, which are done in a controlled manner, and the reason why they're done in such a controlled manner is because it's intended to gradually extract energy from the glucose by these high energy carbon-carbon bonds, by converting the starting reagents into increasingly more stable molecules via the use of enzymes within cellular organelles such as mitochondria that reorganize the functional groups in the molecule to ultimately produce something like 30 to 32 ATP molecules and NAC triphosphate molecules per unit molecule of glucose. And this really is the goal when we talk about respiration, when we talk about the oxygen, what we breathe it in for and what it's used for. Another thing I want to point out is that we can think about the word respiration in a couple of ways, which is we can say respiration and we can mean by it, we can mean external pulmonary respiration in the case of when we're talking about the lungs breathing in, breathing out, that sort of thing. But when we say respiration, what we're really intending as the goal for this breathing in, breathing out is for successful cellular respiration to take place as a result of the lung component of it. That is, by bringing in oxygen and taking out carbon dioxide using our lungs, we intend to transport this oxygen to even the most remote cells of our body using a very neatly organized design system called the circulatory system. And without the circulatory system to transport our newly generated oxygen, the respiratory system as a whole means ultimately nothing. And so another thing I want to point out, it's a little bit off topic, but I just want to point out the idea that unicellular organisms, we're talking about biology and talk about respiration for unicellular organisms, they can actually do this without lungs because they are in direct they are in direct contact with their environment. But we are not. Most of our cells are inside our body and is not in contact with the rest of the environment. Therefore, we need a system that uses the principles of physical chemistry to cause a net diffusion of oxygen in and carbon dioxide out of our pulmonary capillaries, and from the pulmonary capillaries it moves to the rest of our circulatory system, and from the circulatory system it diffuses through our blood vessels, through other capillaries to target tissues all around the body. So that was just the introduction. Now let's talk about the physiology, and again we're doing this in order of the events that this takes place in. That is, first, this is the first part, again like I said before, is the neural component. And we give a name to the specific structure. There's two specific structures within the brainstem that is responsible for this. And these are the respiratory centers. And they actually, between the respiratory centers, they have a further naming system of specific other respiratory centers. And what they really are is they are a network of neurons within the pons and the medulla oblongata, whose job and the way they work is to receive input from various different sources, and it kind of combines the information received from all these different inputs at any given time to make a decision regarding really two primary things: make a decision regarding the rhythm and the depth of breathing. And it does this, another thing I want to say is it does this all the time. You're never not doing this, and this is all autonomic. You're not thinking about it consciously, really. You can in a sense, but but your breathing is done autonomically. And so in this little picture I've drawn here, I want to point out the respiratory systems and their names, their location, that sort of thing. So up here we have this brain structure is called the pons. Again, this is the brainstem. After the brainstem, we get to the midbrain and to the rest of the cerebrum. And then in the brainstem, there's really two primary structures that we're really thinking of when we talk about this, and when we're talking about the respiratory centers. And that is, here's the pons, this big protrusion of tissue right here, and then below it, here's the medulla oblongata, right? And then down here is the rest of the spinal cord, and up here is the rest of the brain. So between the pons and the medulla oblongata, we have two respiratory centers for each of them. Up here we have the pneumotoxic and the apneutic, and then for the medulla oblongata we have the ventral meaning front, and then the dorsal meaning back respiratory centers. And so let's talk about what kind of input, what kind of information are these respiratory centers are receiving in order to make the decision that they make. And that is, there's a few different sources. You have central chemoreceptors. I'm just going to list them and talk about them. So first you have central chemoreceptors, then you have peripheral chemoreceptors, and this is no specific order. Then you have mechanoreceptors, and then you also have information that comes from the hypothalamus, and then also from the cerebrum. So let's talk about it in order. So central chemoreceptors are these specialized neurons located actually in the in the medulla oblongata itself. That is, again, in the brainstem, that monitors changes in the chemical composition of the cerebrospinal fluid. And it's really what it's really looking for. It's detecting changes in levels of CO2 and the pH, or the acidity or alkalinity. And then secondly, we have peripheral chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors are very similar to the central chemoreceptors, except in their location, as well as they actually monitor one more thing. So hence the name central chemoreceptors. They're located centrally at the, like I said, in the brain itself, or the brainstem. And then the peripheral the peripheral chemoreceptors, hence the name, is not located in the central nervous system. These are also, again, specialized sensory neurons. These are located in really two places, the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. And they monitor not only carbon dioxide and pH, they also monitor oxygen. That's one of the things that differs for the peripheral from the central chemoreceptors. And then thirdly, here's the third thing, the third source of input that the respiratory centers receive information from, which is mechanoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors are also peripherally located throughout the different parts of the body. And there are sensory receptors located specifically in the respiratory tract. And the idea is that their job is to detect changes in three things: pressure, stretch, and irritation within the respiratory tract airways, in the lungs, and even in the pulmonary vessels. And then after that, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that primarily deals with emotions such as anxiety, fear, pain, those sorts of things. And the idea is that when you are in a heightened state of emotion such as these, the hypothalamus will send information via signals like to the respiratory center to also aid in influencing the respiratory's decision to regulate the rhythm and the depth of breathing. And then lastly is the cerebrum. When the cerebrum influences the respiratory centers for its decision regarding the rhythm and depth of breathing, it's really mostly voluntary decisions from your voluntary conscious awareness, that sort of thing. And you can do this by choosing to do stuff like sing, yell, talk, that sort of thing, or to hold your breath, or to breathe out forcefully, or to breathe in forcefully, or that sort of thing. So again, the idea is that the first part of external pulmonary respiration is that the respiratory centers have to receive an input of all these different inputs from all this information at any given time, and it makes decision regarding what specifically the breathing rate is going to be, as well as the depth of it. And the way that it does this when it makes the decision is that it actually won't send its output for what it wants to do to the muscle, or excuse me, it doesn't send the output to the lungs itself. Instead, rather, it sends it to the muscles themselves that are involved with contracting to expand and inflate the lungs and to deflate the lungs, so that these muscles will contract or stop contracting. And it does so in unison, these two muscles primarily we're talking about, and they do so in unison as a result of receiving input from the respiratory center to bring about, again, the expansion of the chest cavity and, in fact, the expansion of the lung. And so the reason why the expansion of the chest cavity, therefore the expansion of the lung, causes a net flow of air into the lungs is because when it does so, whenever the lungs expand, there's more volume there. And once the lungs expand, there's more volume, therefore the pressure inside of the lungs, that is the amount of air and its pressure, is negative relative to atmospheric pressure. It's not actually negative in the sense that it's a negative number, really. Rather, and what you're saying by saying that it's negative is you're saying that the external environmental atmospheric pressure is higher and then your lung pressure is lower. And because of this, what actually happened is that air will move into your lungs through all these different structures that you have to go through first to get to the lungs, of course. And which we're going to talk about in a second when we talk anatomy, active physiology, these things. And it causes a net diffusion of air in. Another thing to note is that, to be fair, there is also air going out as you are breathing in, or as your lungs are expanding, inflating. But the idea is that there's a net influx of air in as compared to out. And again, that has to do with just simple diffusion and of stuff moving from high concentration to low concentration. And so the idea is that there's really two muscles that, when we think about the muscles that contract in order to cause the chest cavity to expand, therefore the lung to expand, there's really two muscles in particular when we talk about that. That is, we're talking about the diaphragm. It's this muscle right here, drawn here, underneath the lungs. And then we're also talking about the external intercostal muscles, which I didn't draw, but you kind of have just to imagine that they're there. And the idea is that the respiratory center will send the nerve impulse to these two muscles. And when it sends to the diaphragm, what the diaphragm does is that it contracts and it moves away from the lungs, causing the lungs to move in response towards it. Therefore, the lungs are expanding. And the idea of the external intercostal muscles, which is actually the third outermost layer of intercostal muscles. You have 3 layers of intercostal muscles in between your ribs, which are aligned in different directions. The way that they're positioned is in different directions to each other. And the sort of ordering of them is that the external intercostal muscles are obviously the outermost, and then in the middle between you have the internal, and then between, so you have external, internal, and then innermost. And then when we talk about normal, quiet breathing, what we're really talking about is external intercostal muscles, and what they do when they contract in unison as a response, as a result of the respiratory center sending an impulse to do so. What they actually do is they contract to cause the rib cage to move anterior, posterior, meaning kind of like horizontally, and up. And so these two things happen in unison. If you're ever exercising, or if you're really exerting yourself, that sort of thing, you can also use your abdominal muscles, as well as your sternocleidomastoid muscles, which is in your neck. And this is really only if you have some sort of forceful breathing in or forceful breathing out as a result of exercise, or you just simply willfully want to do that. I could just do that right now if I really wanted to. Okay. So again, the idea is that as oxygen moves through the different sort of respiratory tracts, beginning in the nose and the mouth to the pharynx to the larynx to the trachea to all these different other structures, what it ultimately really does is that it moves through all these structures, and then finally it has to diffuse, again it naturally does so, through a number of layers of cells to reach its target vessel of where it's going to be carried, which is deoxyhemoglobins. Everybody's familiar with hemoglobin. Whenever hemoglobin lacks the 4 oxygens that a singular unit molecule of hemoglobin can carry, you would call it deoxyhemoglobin. And then when it doesn't, and it has the oxygen paired to it, to its iron molecules, you're going to call it oxyhemoglobin. And so one more thing I want to note is that so far we really only talked about inflating the lungs or breathing in. As for expiration or breathing out or deflating the lungs, all these different words really mean the same thing. the way that happens is that it's more so a passive process as opposed to an active process. So when you're breathing in, that's much more active. You're contracting these muscles to cause the lungs to move and to expand, and then air moves in as a result of that. And then when you breathe out, what simply happens is that the respiratory simply stops, sends the neurons, the nerve impulses to the muscles to cause them to stop contracting. And then the calcium ions move from the muscles back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the actual sarcomeres. And then essentially just what happens is that the muscles stop contracting and they rest. And when that happens, the muscles move, specifically also the diaphragm when we think about this, they just move back to their rested state, which causes the chest cavity to do the opposite what it did originally, which is to deflate, to get smaller, and then the air is pushed out because as a result of it. Let me think, what should I talk about next? So let me see what I wrote down here. Okay, here, let's talk about, real quick, let's talk about a little bit about the physical chemistry involved with the diffusion of oxygen through all these different sort of layers of tissue, or really cells, that it has to get through in order to get to the pulmonary capillaries. So first, before I talk about these, again, these are three equations relating to this, and those are all physical chemistry. First, I want to talk about what are the things that oxygen has to kind of go through in order to get to the deoxyhemoglobin, and that is, once it gets to the alveoli, and we'll talk about that too in a second. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Once it gets to the alveoli, in the alveoli is this air sac, and there's a component of the air sac that is actually the air part. This is just air, and then next to, surrounded by this air sac, you also have a sort of like liquid component, and that's the first thing it has to get through. So the alveoli is lined with type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes. The type 1 is kind of just like the actual epithelial cell wall, or like lining of the entire thing. And then the type 2 is the cells that are there to produce this substance called surfactant, whose surfactant's job is supposed to orient itself such that it has a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic end, where the hydrophobic end is oriented towards the alveoli themselves, and then the hydrophilic end is oriented towards the air sac part. And that's the first layer that oxygen has to get through. The second thing it has to get through is it has to get through the epithelial cells of the alveoli, and then from there it has to get through a basement membrane of the alveoli, and then after that it has to go through this connective tissue, which is just elastin and collagen, that sort of thing. And then from there it has to get through the basement membrane of the capillary, and then through the endothelial lining of the capillary, which is just like a single cellular. And then from there it has to get into the plasma of the pulmonary capillary, so the plasma, the liquid component. And from there it has to get to the red blood cells, and it's not done. After you get to the red blood cell, then you can find the deoxyhemoglobin. So the point of me saying all that is, when we look at this picture here, we can think about how oxygen has to move through all of these macro structures. And then once we get here, we zoom in at the very end of these branches, you have these alveoli here that branches off. And in these alveoli, you have to go through even more, and I guess you would say microscopic. So this is all macroscopic movement of air, and then here we have the microscopic movement of air. And one thing I want to note with the microscopic portion, that is the alveoli, is that it's mostly water. Most of your body is water, and most of these cells that it's supposed to diffuse through in order to reach its target vessel is mostly water. And so when we think about that, that's the reason why we have these three physical chemistry laws that relate to oxygen diffusing through water, or diffusing into water, sorry, because that's exactly what is happening, right? So the first one is Henry's law. Henry's law has to do with solubility of oxygen into a liquid. So if you were to think about this, say if you have like a jar and you had water in it, and you were looking at the surface layer of the water, what you would notice is that the oxygen above the water is constantly going in random directions, and sometimes they will just, out of pure coincidence, they'll run into the water and it will naturally diffuse into the water. Some solvents And some solutes at different temperatures will have different concentrations of how well they can be soluble into that liquid. And as you increase, and then these three things, okay, let me look at this. Henry's law, the idea of it, is it basically tells you just that. It tells you the concentration of the gas molecules immersed into the liquid water, or I guess I should say liquid solvent, based off of the partial pressure of the gas divided by K of H, which is this constant, which you can look up in a table of constants, which you would have to, basically when you look at the table of constants, you have to consider three things. It takes into account these three things: solute, the identity of the solvent, and temperature. And as you have a higher temperature, it won't be as easily dissolved. And basically what it says, Henry's law says that there will be more it will be more soluble for a gas to enter into the liquid phase, or not the liquid phase, into a liquid, if you have a higher partial pressure of that gas above the liquid, which can also be a result of more particles just simply being there. Because if you have more particles, as long as if those more particles are aren't in like proportion to another particle in the mixture, there will be more likely for it to be soluble in it. And then K of H, the higher K of H is, the less soluble it is. The lower the K of H value is, the more soluble it is. And so that brings me to this second equation. This second equation is the alveolar gas equation. This is a equation used to estimate it's the equation used to estimate what the partial pressure of oxygen is in the alveoli. Again, the alveoli are these sacs, and we can't actually go in and microscopically like sort of take a measuring of the partial pressure of oxygen in these alveoli sacs at any given moment. So instead, what we can turn to is we can turn to this equation, which tells us, based off of the oxygen going in, which is this first part right here, and then minus the oxygen going out, which is the second part here. And so let's talk about what each of these things sort of represent. This first variable right here represents the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the oxygen component, or like the oxygen, or like the air component, sorry. This next part, again, this whole component right here, this sort of whoop, is oxygen in, this whoop is oxygen out. This next variable right here represents the concentration of oxygen in the air breathed in, and it's multiplied by these two things. This represents the atmospheric pressure, which is going to probably be 760 millimeters of mercury, or 1 atmosphere. And then this represents the partial pressure of water vapor in the lungs, which is usually 47 millimeters of mercury. Which also, I think I'll talk about this in a moment, but again, when air moves into your respiratory tract, it becomes immediately humidified so that the physical chemistry can work for a number of reasons. And it also actually becomes warmed, which is why whenever you're hot, you're breathing out a bunch. And whenever like animals such as dogs who don't have sweat glands because they have so much fur, they resort to panting as a way of expelling heat, and the idea is that as they're breathing in more air, the air gets heated, the heat goes from their body to some of the air, and then they breathe the air out, and then some of the heat is expelled. And then this minus portion represents air being breathed out. This variable right here represents the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood, which also represents the amount of carbon dioxide diffused from blood to alveoli. And then this second part is something called the respiratory quotient. It is the ratio of carbon dioxide produced to oxygen consumed, and it's around 0.8. This is usually represented, this is supposed to be capital Q too. This is usually also influenced by metabolic state of the person. So in other words, if they are sick or something, and it'll influence that number. And so, let me adjust this. And so lastly, we have this third equation, Adolf Fick's law of diffusion. Adolf Fick's law of diffusion actually talks about, this talks about the solubility of oxygen going to liquid. This talks about the partial pressure of oxygen within an alveoli, the air in the air component of the alveoli. And then lastly, this last equation, Adolf Fick's law of diffusion, talks about the rate, this is what this V represents, the rate of the movement of molecules as they diffuse through the sort of membranes, diffuse through all these things like I talked about before, they have to diffuse through, which is mostly water, in order to get to its target vessel. So this represents, this V here represents the rate of particles moving through all these different layers of stuff it has to get through. And so let's just talk about what each one of these things represent. So this P1 minus P2 actually relates to the alveolar gas equation in the sense that P1 is the partial pressure of oxygen on the original starting point, which is actually equal to this, right? This is the alveoli and the air component, and this is the partial pressure of the oxygen on the very last end point of where it is, what it wants to get to. In this case, you could say that could be the plasma. You could say this in the red blood cell. So this is also, delta P, P1 minus P2, and multiplied by A. A is the surface area for each one of these little things that it has to pass through in order to get to its target location. A is the surface area. The more surface area, I think I wrote this down. Yeah, the more surface area you have, the faster the rate is going to move, which is why the lungs has the surface area. This is also why the lungs have a surface area of, I think a tennis court is what I've heard it said. So you want surface area in order to maximize the efficiency of the rate of molecules moving through all these different layers to reach its target vessel. And then D represents the diffusion constant. It's equal to solubility, which again has to do with Henry's law, over the molecular weight squared. And then lastly, we have T here. And this represents the thickness of the membrane walls. So let's talk about, all of these things I've written on the left here all contribute to a higher number of V, therefore a higher value of V here, therefore a higher rate of the particles moving through all these different sort of cells or tissues, wherever you want to put it. And so let's just go in the order of it. So a thin wall, in other words, a small number here will make it go faster. A small molecular weight, in other words, here will also, like a smaller thing moves faster, of course, that makes sense. And then here we have a higher P1, which again has to do with this, or a number of molecules, because when you have more molecules, what that usually also means is a higher partial pressure, because there's more molecules to hit, just to hit the thing that it's causing the pressure towards. Then we talked about surface area. Higher surface area, the better, and then the more soluble it is, the better, which is soluble relates to D, which is this. So now let's think about anatomy real quick. So let's go back to this little picture. This picture here, let's talk about, we've already talked about this. We've talked about the respiratory center, the neural component, and we've already talked about the alveoli. Let's talk about this, which is the sort of different structures that has to pass through. And let's talk about the lungs themselves. So let's talk about the lungs. So the lungs, you have the right lobe as indicated by this R, and you have the left lobe as indicated by this left L, relative to the person's perspective, not so much as ours, which is why it looks backwards. And what you will notice is that because the heart sits in this mediastin, which is, the mediastin is the term we use to describe this sort of area right here in between the lungs and the chest cavity. Because the heart sits a little more so to the left as opposed to the right, the lung has to make up for that by having this thing called a cardiac notch, where the heart sits. And for this reason, the left lung is slightly smaller than the right lung. And for this reason also, you have two lobes of your left lung, and you have 3 lobes in your right lung. There's also these fissures throughout the lungs. Right now this is drawn in 2D, but you also have to imagine that's 3D, so it's going to wrap a little weirdly. And these fissures kind of separate the lung into separate, distinct lobes through which air passes through. And these fissures, so we call this fissure in the left lung the oblique fissure. There's only one. And in the right lung we have 2. This is the oblique here, and then this is the horizontal. And then we would call for the left lung, this would be the upper lobe, lower lobe. And then for the right, we would say upper, middle, lower. Very, very intuitive, hard to mix up. So let's talk about the pathway of air macroscopically. So here, obviously, everyone knows that you can breathe in through one of 2 ways. You can breathe in through your nose, or you can breathe through your mouth. Either way, when you breathe in your nose and your mouth, air has to enter in through either A, your nasal cavity, or B, your oral cavity. And from there, if it enters through your nose, therefore your nasal cavity, it has to go through your nasopharynx to reach your laryngopharynx, and it goes through your mouth, it goes to the oral cavity, and then from the oral cavity, it will go through the oral pharynx to the laryngopharynx. And what I'm really saying when I say that is basically immediately thereafter, when air passes through your nose or your mouth, there is two distinct structures in your throat called the pharynx and the larynx that air moves through to reach the trachea. And the trachea is this little structure right here with these lines drawn through. These are cartilage, hyaline cartilage rings that I've drawn here, which you can barely see. And the idea is that first it goes through the pharynx, which is subdivided into three parts, like I said before: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx leads into the larynx, and the larynx leads into the trachea, if as long as if the epiglottis doesn't influence it, which epiglottis is the structure that it moves, it will basically move in and out to cause either air to go to the trachea or food to go to the esophagus, and it's autonomic controlled. And yeah, and so air will move from the pharynx to the larynx to the trachea. The trachea, as well as most of your respiratory tract, is going to be lined with the semicircular hyaline cartilage all throughout it, as well as smooth muscle within the layers of the respiratory tract. And the idea is a smooth muscle will contract or not contract. And people with asthma, their smooth muscle in the respiratory tract will contract when it's not supposed to, which causes the respiratory tract to be constricted, and that's why they can't breathe as well, as because the smooth muscle gets contracted for a number of reasons. And so after the trachea reaches the lungs through the mediastinum, it gets a different name, and that is it now becomes the left and the right primary bronchi. So it's pretty intuitive. So the one on the left side is the left bronchi, and the one on the right side is the right bronchi. And I've also drawn this picture here to indicate sort of a more complicated fashion what this kind of looks like. And then this is also the segments. There's several segments. I don't really want to talk about this in this video. And this is kind of like the consistent universal layout that the primary bronchi will follow. This picture right here, and these are the different segments that it will leach to, which the segments are within the regions of the lobes. And basically what we say is we say that here's the primary bronchi, and we'll say this one always goes in this direction to this segment, and this one goes to that segment. And then from there it will divide a total of 20, or the respiratory tract will divide a total of 23 times to reach about 500 million not capillaries, alveoli. Returning to this picture though, the left and the right primary bronchi will further divide into the secondary bronchi, and then from there to the tertiary bronchi as it breaks off even more. And then from there you get to bronchioles, and then from there you go to the alveolar ducts, and then to the alveoli. And like I said before, what I'm about to say next, the next sort of pathway that has to follow through, we just talked about. I'm going to say it again though, just because it seems intuitive, because we're talking about the total complete pathway there. And that is from the alveoli, it will go through the external layer of fluid in the alveoli, that is the cervicant. Then it'll go through the simple squamous epithelial cell, that is the alveoli. Then it'll go through the basement membrane of the alveoli, then there's the connective tissue, then the basement membrane of capillary, then the capillary endothelial cell wall, or the wall of the capillary, then the plasma, red blood cell, hemoglobin, all that good stuff. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, I do remember. I made another sheet. Last but not least, we have a few different terms that we like to use to describe the sort of input and output, how air is moving in and out of the lungs at any given moment, and how much like sort of the amount of content that we have. First is the total lung capacity. As the name indicates, this refers to the total amount of air the lungs can hold, and is equal to, well, we're going to talk about this in a second, but it's equal to the vital capacity plus the residual volume. Second, we have the vital capacity. I'm going to go over the numbers. Vital capacity is the maximum amount of air that can be moved in and out of the lungs. Third is tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of air moved in or out during normal quiet breathing, so like normal ventilation. Then inspiratory and expiratory reserve. These two are related to each other in the sense that this is the additional amount of air that can be inhaled or exhaled relative to whether inspiratory or expiratory. with a forceful inspiration or expiration. And then lastly, we have the residual volume. I mentioned this in a couple seconds ago. This is the amount of air that must remain in the lungs at all times. And the reason for this is because the lungs never actually fully deflate with exhalation, even if it is forced. There's always about 1.2 liters of volume of air that remains even after maximal exhalation. Lastly, one more thing I want to point concerning the, I think I covered everything, yeah. One more thing I want to point out is that the respiratory tract is also lined with a lot of mucus, and the idea is that these cells, specialized cells throughout the respiratory tract called goblet cells, their job is to produce the mucus. And the idea is that on the apical surface, cellular surface of the cells lining the respiratory tract, apical meaning the outermost layer of the cell protruding out into the respiratory tract in the middle of it, there are these cellular structures called cilia, and they have actin and myosin. And the idea is that as mucus is being produced in the respiratory tract, the mucus traps stuff that's not supposed to be there, such as dust, pathogens, irritants, that sort of thing. And the cilia is lined all throughout the respiratory tract, and the idea is that there's so many of them, and what they do is that they will autonomically, without your conscious control, they will contract. The myosin and actin will move up and down they will contract, and it will move the cilia and kind of like that, and it will gradually move the mucus upwards and out. And the idea also is that as you go farther and farther into the respiratory tract, you actually have less and less goblet cells, therefore less mucus, because you don't want, once you reach the end branches and you get to the alveoli ducts and the alveoli, you really don't want mucus there, because that's going to mess with everything. So as you go down, there's even less and less. Again, also air is humidified and it's heated. One more thing I just remembered that I probably should have included, which is that between oxygen and carbon dioxide is actually much more soluble than oxygen. I remember the number was something like 26 times more soluble than oxygen in liquid, in water. But I also remember reading that, and specifically in the respiratory tract, and in this specific context, the number is more so, it's a little lower, it's about 22 times due to the context. But the idea is that the reason why this still happens is because oxygen moves in, and the reason why it still happens though is because there's a net diffusion of it. There's more oxygen in the air, and there's less in the capillaries relative to each other. Therefore, there's a net diffusion from from high concentration to low concentration, and vice versa. The same with carbon dioxide. So that is it for this video. Just to reiterate and to sort of conclude everything that I said before, the respiratory system's goal is to bring in oxygen from the external environment to every single cell of your body via the circulatory system, also, and to bring carbon dioxide out. And the way it does this is that air will, as a result of signals from your respiratory centers, that use input from various receptors throughout your body, it will cause a contraction of your muscles. Muscles contract, chest cavity becomes bigger, lungs expand, there's less air in the lungs as compared to the environment, therefore air moves into the lungs. Once it moves into the lungs, it follows this little pathway, 23 times of branching, till it reaches these alveoli, these little air sacs here, and then it naturally will diffuse through the alveoli to reach through all these different layers and then of cells and things it has to get through. And you can represent this with physical chemistry, and this is physical chemistry. You represent these equations, and eventually the idea is you want to reach the pulmonary capillaries, and within the pulmonary capillaries you want to reach the deoxyhemoglobin, which goes back to the heart, and from the heart to the aorta, and then from the aorta to everything else. And so that's it.